Okay, now that race, that was much more like it. This was the kind of race that we wanted, where people could, overtake. And shout out goes to a brand new love of mine. Turn 4, I love you! But we now must move on to other winners. Forget the Qatar sprint, forget Baku, heck, you can even forget China. This weekend is where I think Oscar set the stage for him to become the one and only Claren Jockey. This entire weekend was absolutely faultless. The timing of it couldn't have been more important after the paralysis of Suzuka for McLaren. 15 seconds ahead of Russell, and that was including a safety car. Because this might have slipped by some people, but this is probably one of the best examples of him learning from the school of Mark Webber. Him turning the screw against his teammate and team without making it look like he's turning the screw, not being rude about it. In the light of Lando saying that the MCL39 is not the fastest car right now and that others may be better, Oscar is, quote, not shying away from admitting that right now the McLaren is the fastest, and to say otherwise, according to Piastri, is not correct. Now, that immediately just screams Mark Webber in just like stating the obvious that goes against the team edict and what his teammate is saying, and that's just like, oh. Either it's making out Lando is indeed sandbagging, or is simply not adapting to the car to the same way that Oscar is. And right now, based on the race, sure, Lando does get a place in the winners category, but as I will say in a moment, it wasn't exactly the cleanest, especially when you look at how Oscar managed to sustain pole position and then run off with it, not being challenged once. These kind of mind games, these are really, really subtle ones, because I doubt that you're going to get Oscar calling Lando out overtly. It's going to be the little things, results, being honest with his analyses. McLaren are really doing it. They're romping away with the constructors, and now both drivers are at the top of the championship. There are now 3 points between them. And after Australia's missed opportunity, well, Oscar's back in the room, whereas I thought he was going to be miles behind it. But no, he's already made up the deficit, only 3 points. But okay, to be fair to Lando, considering that he managed to get up from 6th to 3rd, he is technically a winner. He did get onto the podium after a lackluster qualifying, and is still ahead in the championship, with Max's car absolutely not cooperating. Happy days, right? Because when you look at the championship standings, technically, Lando has increased the gap between himself and the person in 2nd place. But when you're considering that we're going into Jeddah, a place where Oscar has outperformed Lando on both occasions they've been working together, this is not a good start to this particular leg in the Formula 1 calendar. In qualifying, after Q3, after not finding enough time as all of the others in the front running pack did, Lando looked absolutely shattered, absolutely broken. And sure, Lando is the kind of guy that wears his heart on his sleeve, and I do appreciate and respect his honesty. But in this particular fracas with the school of Mark Webber going against him on the other side of the garage, this might not be the smartest way to go about things. And as for the race itself, yeah, he got on the podium. Happy days. Great. Well done. Really gives the major shareholders of McLaren something to cheer about. And also, Lando had a really busy day trying to get back onto the podium, starting too far ahead of his box, a 5-second penalty, inconsistent pace at times where Leclerc was really getting the best of him and he ultimately couldn't get past George. This is a far cry from how he was vibing during the preseason testing when he looked like he owned the place. However, I do still classify this as a win because he made progress, he managed to get some points, and he's still leading the championship. So it's something that I think is commendable, but it's certainly nowhere near as clean as how Oscar managed to perform this weekend. But hey, a win's a win. And a win indeed comes the way of Alpine for the first time with Pierre Gasly. He once again showed he's really good around this track, showing that the Alpine car has the potential to do well and continue the trend from last year of mixing it up with the front runners and putting a strong case for the top 5. Because you've only got to look at what he did in qualifying. Sure, Antonelli did get a 1-place grid drop through an administrative error on Mercedes' part, which was arguably unfair, but Pierre was right there and he ended up on the 2nd row. That is something to be really proud of, and okay, it didn't translate to a 4th place in the race, but you got to remember what the Alpine's going up against. They've still got some work to do on the race front, but they still came away with points. And for nearly half the race, Pierre was able to keep Max Verstappen behind him. Sure, Verstappen was not dealing with the best of strategies at this time, and a particularly and surprisingly sloppy pit crew and operational errors up the wazoo, but Gasly held him back. And I'm pretty sure in the back of his mind, he would have been feeling really good round about now. The team that left him on hold for the better part of 3 and a bit seasons at AlphaTauri, they're struggling, and he managed to keep Max behind him. That would have been so good, him playing that thought in his mind, motivating him to keep 6th. He got 7th, but still, Alpine are now off the board, they've got points, they're not last anymore. But then when you step back and take into account the entire weekend, this was a tour de force for George Russell. Sure, the win wasn't going to happen, but 2nd place, that did happen. He is genuinely, as I've been saying, a dark horse for this competition, and some people are still reckoning he's about to be dropped from Mercedes in favour of Max Verstappen. I mean, come off it. Mercedes are sitting pretty in 2nd place in the Constructors. Both their drivers get on like a house on fire at this very important moment in Antonelli's formative years in Formula 1. Russell's having the time of his life, and he managed to come up against all sorts of adversity. His car glitching out on him, the transponder failing, and him pressing the radio button, then it activates the DRS. He had to operate it manually. He got away with the potential penalty, a grid drop or a time penalty, because, well, he didn't really make much of an advantage, and he actually lost more time in the following corner when he lifted. But the fact is, though, there were so many things going against him. A McLaren steaming up behind him. He managed to make that audacious strategy last 24 laps and repeat what he did at Spa, and showing that the Belgian Grand Prix performance, that was no fluke. And I knew this was coming the moment they put on those soft tyres. Those C3s, that Mercedes loves that compound. That was a hugely big gamble Mercedes doesn't often do. And you could tell he was feeling plucky, because when they told him that he might not have any display on his steering wheel, he then quipped, well, so long as it doesn't come off, I'm fine. Well, yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but still, he had enough time to have a dig at one of his buddies, Fernando. And then to quote one of my mutuals, the gritty Haas strikes again. Nobody was quite sure how they would perform this weekend. The test was a complete mystery. But the car had race pace, and the team were able to make good of the safety car. They managed to help catapult Ocon and Dabert into the points. Ocon managing to come back from that Q2 accident, which would have really unsettled him, to then get 8th place, holding back Tsunoda in a admittedly damaged Red Bull, not getting too far behind Max Verstappen in 7th, and then Oliver Bearman coming back from last to 10th, making good use of that strategy with the safety car. It was a brilliant masterclass, and all of this is done. Both of these drivers, they are in a good place right now, and people thought that Esteban would tear Oliver apart. No, they're really holding their own. They're fighting the good fight with their team. Ayo Komatsu has built a really good force, and Laura Muller with Esteban is turning out to be an absolute unit. And now, thanks to Oliver Bearman's point in particular, they have now leapt past Williams by a singular point to then be 5th in the Constructors. And no one expected that to happen this quickly. Haas has come alive, both these drivers are on it, and they made good use of the relative chaos that was that unexpected safety car. I seriously thought it was going to be a virtual safety car, but here we are. And then we get to the meh section, and Ferrari starts us off with this one. All in all, it was a perfectly decent race weekend for the team, but they just simply did not have the pace to stay near the front, despite a great qualifying from Leclerc. Hamilton did manage to recover from a very mediocre qualifying to end up 5th place. He was hinting at satisfaction from the upgrades that came the team's way, related to the floor and underside. And even though Leclerc just could not stay in touching distance of Piastri and maintain that 2nd place on the grid after Russell's penalty, he was still able to once again finish just outside the podium in 4th place and really assert that he is the one still fighting the good fight in the case of Ferrari. It was a really bold effort, and the difference here, unlike Suzuka, where Charles had a really lonely race, he was able to be quite feisty with some of the big guys, really holding back Lando more than I would have expected. So Lando had to get really crafty and really gutsy to get past him from that glorious turn 4. Oh my god, turn 4, I just could kiss you again. But I won't. But like I said, both drivers admit the pace is still lacking when compared to where they should be, where they were last year. But that being said, it was a good recovery drive, 22 points in the kitty, and it puts the Scuderia back into the fight for the top 3 when it looked like they were really ending up becoming adrift from Red Bull, Mercedes and McLaren. Also, most importantly, Lewis was happy that he could push in this car and do something with it. So that is a cause for a mini celebration that the rocky period of Ferrari may be coming to an end and a sense of stability might be returning. I'm not quite sure about the long-term potential of this team, but they're back in the game for the front-running packs. Second place might be a mounting cause. At least try and get one over Red Bull, because they struggled this weekend, whereas Ferrari, good clutch of points, they're back in the game. And then I put Antonelli. Yes, points eluded him, but that was mainly down to a very heroic attempt at making an impromptu 3-stop strategy work out for him. It ultimately didn't, but by only half a second to try and claw back a point. That and, typical rookie errors. He took too much out of the tyres, he was really hustling that car, the dirty air really didn't help his fight back. There were many things going against his direction. But you can look the other way simply for the fact that he did conduct himself, he didn't make any accidents, and at some point, when he did have the car and tyres underneath him, he was incredibly feisty in being able to make a little bit of progress back up the pack, and I still will not forget that turn 4 situation. He managed to outpace Max. Sure, Verstappen was compromised, but that singular vision of Verstappen versus the Italian Stappen, and the Italian Stappen coming out top, and they kept it clean? Oh, that was excellent fan service in my honest opinion. There's clearly something in this kid, and whilst it wasn't to be in terms of scoring, we do get to see a glimpse of what there is potentially in the future, and it was fun. He was plucky, but he missed out on 10th to his grisly power by half a second. It really does stand to reason the team was trying to be plucky with their drivers and their strategies. It worked out great for George, not quite so well for Kimi, but it was worth a try. They gave it a go. Now, I can imagine that some of you might be thinking that, oh, you're just being biased because you like Yuki at the moment. Now, let me make this clear. I'm just glad Tsunoda gets to have a chance at this team. And had Max Verstappen been much more in contention for a podium, we would have still been lauding Yuki getting 9th place anyway. So getting 9th place in these circumstances, almost taking out Ocon when this car is simply not working around this track, Verstappen in 7th, not that far up ahead, this was even better. So this was enough to lift Yuki out of where Red Bull is going to be in this list. Of course, there is room for improvement, but on a day where the team needed damage limitation, having the second car also score was helpful considering the other car did not score much more points. He did his part, Yuki, despite the antics in the pits, which probably went some way to the Japanese driver losing 8th to Ocon. But that being said, I am not excusing Yuki and saying that he had a clean race. He absolutely did not. Me being a Carlos Sainz well-wisher, it hurt like hell seeing them tussle, Carlos getting a hole in his side pod, Yuki's wing exploding down the straight before turn 4. It made my heart stop for a second there. Him, Tsunoda, getting Leclerc special. And then in turn, Yuki was partly responsible for causing that safety car in the first place. So, yeah, it was not a clean race. It was scruffy. There was more that he could have done, but ultimately he didn't get a penalty from that tangle with Carlos, and he did score some points. So he at least managed to lift the spirits, and at least Red Bull had a double points finish for once. And then we get to the losers, and we have to start off with the live timings. What live timings? Now, okay, speaking as somebody who has a post-production background, I understand that a brand new set of graphics does take some time to really kind of iron out the bugs and whatnot, especially when you've got a brand new supplier of live timings, that being Tag Heuer. But quite frankly, at this point, some of these issues should have been ironed out at this point. We've gone back to the days where we were lucky to even get a timing update at the end of every lap. We've become so used to having live timings for every single mini sector that to not have it at this point, and then having the replay graphic being up when it's actually live, these are kind of situations which really drop the ball and make this entire production out to be an absolute joke. And then George's transponder failed, and you think there would have been a backup, but then did the backup to the main unit fail as well? What's going on here? It was just a really bad time, and it really took away from the fight at the front and seeing how far Oscar was pulling away. I wanted to see what was going on with the battle between Ocon and Tsunoda. And yeah, I know, first world problems and all that, but it is a case of the enjoyment factor and a level of professionalism here. This wasn't good, and I just felt like I needed to air out my own grievances, and I'm pretty sure you did too. And then we do have to kick off with a team, and that is Williams. But this car was a car that could have scored good points, but multiple factors got in the way of that. Some of them outside the team's control, some of it through driver error and simply hustling too hard. Now, I have to start off this section by saying with Alex Albon, it was incredibly unfortunate and unjust for Nico Hülkenberg's lap time in Q1 to be deleted, which would have meant that Albon would have gotten into Q2, and then based on Carlos's performance and potential, both Williams would have been in Q3, and then a double points finish would have been a little bit more likely. This was a really crying shame for Alex, and he managed to battle back up to 12, but it did go to show that another points finish for Albon was in the offing, but that delayed administrative action from the FIA compromised Williams dearly and lost them 5th place in the Constructors' in my honest opinion. And then in the case of Sainz, yeah, this was kind of driver error, but a good sign is that he is able at least to push the car, which was a major complaint of him back the previous couple of races where he felt like he couldn't push the car. But at the same time, he then pushed a bit too hard. Admittedly, he did very good at keeping right behind Gasly in the DRS to make good on that strategy, but unfortunately the safety car put paid to that. He then cooked his tyres, he fell back, and then ultimately it was going to be a miracle if he managed to cling on to 10th, maybe. But then he had the tussle with Tsunoda, he then got a big hole in his side pod, he had to retire the car, and then he got a 10-second time penalty for another tangle. It was just not going Carlos's way, but at least he was able to hustle. He's able to do something with that car, but ultimately, he really didn't do the team any favours. He did scupper an 8th place in qualifying, starting ahead of Lewis Hamilton, which would have been a huge boost for his revenge arc prospects. Alex, he was genuinely robbed of an opportunity to try and start closer to the top 10. So, I just felt like it was really unlucky, but at least it had nothing to do with the car's performance, because it looked good. But qualifying, it was just completely clouded it. Then, Sauber. Ugh. Nico had potential to be a thorn in the side of the midfield, but a later than expected track limits violation, like I said, pushed him back. And then he got disqualified for excessive plank wear, like we saw with the Ferrari of Hamilton back in China. Couple that with the car simply not being good enough and Bortoletto being the last of the classified finishers, this was not a good time of Vesa Sauber, and they really need to do something about it. And sure, Jonathan Wheatley will help them on operational level, but there are other factors at play here that really need to be improved, such as, well, the car being better in a race and it not fading away. We all thought it was a dawn in Australia where they were able to get Hülkenberg into the points, but it was a false dawn. There needs to be something done here. Well, okay, to be fair, at least they weren't really off the pace. They weren't in danger of being lapped, at least. So that is something. They have the chance to make progress. They're just not there yet. Then we get to Jack Doohan. You might think I'm being unfair here, because it did start off strong with him narrowly missing out on Q3. But the race itself proved to be nothing special, because Alpine's lack of consistency in not really knowing where their car is, it's great in qualifying, but in the race, needs a little bit more work. It's really not giving the drivers, both Pierre and Jack, the confidence to be able to know what their prospects are in the race, and therefore, it just resulted in Jack not kicking on. He wasn't able to make overtakes where it mattered, and ultimately it saw him down in 14th place, behind Hadjar. And him falling behind Hadjar was down to him getting a track limits time penalty. It was just a case of fighting through the pain from Suzuka's practice incident, but the team knew to back him up and give him room to breathe. Again, you might be thinking I'm unfair and that maybe Doohan deserves to be in the meh category. Well, I might have given it to him if he managed to hang around in like 11th and 12th and maybe hustling Bearman for that 10th place position, but right now, it's just not good enough. And at this time, Alpine are looking for any excuse to drop him. And it wasn't great for Racing Bulls either. After a strong start to the season, it was just simply off the boil this weekend. The drivers equally as thrown off. Hadjar complaining of wheel spin, which put paid to any hopes of a good qualifying session again, and then a terrible start on Isaac's part sent him back down the order. However, I admonish him of most of the responsibility of why they're down here, because at least he did fight back from that really bad start to get back up to 13th. He was trying his best to try and make some good progress, and he did. The same couldn't be said about his other teammate, the slightly more experienced one, Liam Lawson. It's a good thing he's doing this in a Racing Bulls rather than the senior team's car, because this was yet another scruffy race which saw his slightly less experienced teammate look more composed. Now, okay, you might be arguing that at least Liam gave it a go, as in the words of Christian Horner, and tried to make some good lunging overtakes. Yes, he was incredibly bold. But neither was he clean about it. He did not lick the stamp fully and sent it. He sent it, but then the stamp fell off. And this coming at the moment when it was very clear that the stewards around Bahrain were in a really bad mood and handing out penalties like they were candy. And it resulted in Lawson getting a time penalty of his own. And it was just all downhill from there. It was just not a clean weekend. And you might be thinking, well, what does it matter, Law? They sent him to Racing Bulls to find his feet with less scrutiny. I mean, that's already died a death. But at the same time, there are no prospects coming up from the junior categories that may try and take him out for 2026, right? Right? Yes, the car wasn't on the ball today, but this is yet another example of Lawson trying too hard. But when you look to F2, 3 Red Bull juniors there, the likes of Pepe Marti having a huge uptick and response to a very disappointing 2024, and then a steady Arvid Lindblad opening up his F2 tally around Bahrain, Liam really needs to step up to survive going after this year. And as for the senior team, oh, this was a weekend where not only the effects of Adrian Newey's absence were felt, but also the lack of Jonathan Wheatley's. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the sporting director got to do with anything? Well, one of Jonathan's main responsibility was the day-to-day operations of the Red Bull pit crew and the garage to make sure things were running smoothly, and such kerfuffles, such as the automated pit lighting system, were working as intended and were not prone to glitching out, which is exactly what happened to both the drivers and cost them 2 seconds respectively. And that made such a difference for their race. And then Max having an issue with a sticky front tyre that wasn't coming off properly, so he lost time there. It was a situation where it did cost them points. Both drivers could have been that little bit higher. Max a little bit closer to Hamilton to at least try and get 5th place. Yuki being able to at least get 8th place, so they probably cost themselves at least a good potential 4 points. I mean, 4 points doesn't sound a lot in the case of Red Bull, but considering how many they scored this weekend, that would have been a huge little boost, a little bit closer to Ferrari, who are now really closing the gap on them. And then the switch to the relatively untested C1 tyre for Max, it hampered his mid-race momentum. It was all falling apart, and really demonstrating that Jonathan's influence was crucial, as well as Newey's, really underrated, because the pit crew looks sloppy in comparison to what we've expected from them for several years. And as we saw in the case of Mercedes, pit stops are really important, and if you don't pay much attention to them, you can lose out on results, and thankfully Mercedes have actually taken a look at it, them historically being so-so. Now they're pretty good, up there with the leaders, good under 2.5 second stops, whereas with Red Bull, last time out at Suzuka, that was over 3.5 seconds, what's going on? And it was a race where Max said everything did go wrong. Quite frankly, it was a disaster, and it was a miracle he could manage to recover from that hard tyre mess-up and get 6th place, at least a decent result on paper. But how he got there was, oh, it was not clean. And with Russell right behind him in the championship standings, he's only 14 points, George, behind Piastri. Yeah, Max is still in the hunt, but there are more discussions to be had here, and according to various journalistic reports, Max's manager was not having a good time with Helmut Marko, and there are many discussions to be had, including a lot more emergency meetings. What's going to be happening here? It makes Suzuka look like it happened last year or something like that. How things changed in a week. And this is a track, Bahrain, which made the opening statements to 2023 and 2024 for Red Bull. This is a completely different game. And the same applies to Aston Martin, because after a reasonable start, the team lost ground. Lance's 10 points still the only points to their name. Both drivers had clean starts, sure, their race strategies involved early pit stops too, trying to go long with the hope of no safety cars. However, like we saw with Verstappen, that C1 tyre is no good to anybody, at least at the beginning of the race, because it really didn't amount to anything in terms of giving the two drivers, Alonso and Stroll, forward momentum. And they were already on the back foot in terms of qualifying, Lance especially. And sure enough, the safety car did come out and ruined the party for either of them. Alonso expressing concerns about the car's general lack of competitiveness, especially around low-speed corners and traction zones, which are critical around here. I still remember the moment when Fernando got that overtake on Lewis a couple of years ago and said, bye-bye. Well, that's a distant memory as well, and the only thing he'll be saying bye-bye to now is his steering wheel. This was just a hapless race for this team, especially with Haas scoring a decent amount of points, Alpine getting off the blocks, now only 4 points behind Aston Martin. At least VCarb didn't have a good race, because at this point, if this keeps going and VCarb find their form again, Aston Martin could be 9th. 9th in the constructors, and Lance is the one carrying them, still. So you could say that Aston Martin in the last 2 years have flopped hard, but which teams have been as bigger flops, if not bigger, in the past? To find out, in my opinion, the 10 cars that were the biggest letdowns for their teams in the history of the sport, watch this video next, straight after this one.